We then move on to the era of 20th century Australian works. Now, in this era, we really see new modern development. So just like everything else was moving on in the 20th century, just so was Australian literature. And this explored new controversial themes which were relevant, such as feminism, multiculturalism, and issues like mental illness, which perhaps had previously not been addressed. So we have Australian poets who were definitely prominent during this era. For example, the poet Judith Wright. You also have the poet Gwen Harwood, who focused on a number of issues. For example, the relationship between a mother and a child. That's definitely a motif throughout Harwood's work. We also have the poet Kenneth Slessor, who wrote poems which were extremely iconic and focused on definitely a relationship between place and what it meant to be Australian. For example, Slessor's poem 5 Bells focuses on a ferry accident in Sydney Harbour. So we really have the way in which he relates things specifically to Australia. The poet Les Murray, for example, in his work An Absolutely Ordinary Rainbow. These sort of poets focused on new issues such as mental illness and the idea that Australians perhaps didn't belong in the concrete jungle of big cities and big offices. Peter Minter was another famous Australian poet during this era. Judith Beveridge as well was a 20th century Australian poet who, through new conventions and new stylistic ideas, really aimed to create a new era of poetry in this country. Australian novelists were also very prominent during this period. And we have quite a line between traditional Australian novelists during the 19th century, in kind of the earlier time of the 19th century, and also the later ones in the very recent times, who are really focusing on very modern issues. So you have the more traditional Miles Franklin, who really is a national Australian literary icon. For example, her work, My Brilliant Career, which focuses on the plight of this girl called Sibylla, who's living in the bush. So we're dealing with these same sort of themes, which we saw earlier on in the bush poetry, or even the ripping yarn, and just translating them into a more modern form. We also have authors such as Colin Thiele, David Malouf, who really focused on a relationship to place and the relationship between a person and the place and nature where they live. Patrick White, Peter Carey. We now move on to the fourth era of Australian literary works, and that is Aboriginal writers. Now, as we previously discussed, Aboriginal authors didn't begin even though Aboriginals were living thousands and thousands of years in Australia before European settlement. Their very oral tradition means that not much was written down. However, it's only noticed recently in Australian history that the plight of Aboriginals under white people is actually a significant issue which needs to be expressed. And obviously literature is a really good way to express ideas. This means that Australian writers such as Jack Davis, Kevin Gilbert, Oodgeroo Noonuckle, who actually changed her name back to her Aboriginal name from her English name Kath Walker, and Lionel Fogarty. These are the sort of Aboriginal writers which became quite famous in this period for spreading the Aboriginal story, which had previously just been completely untold and forgotten by the white settlement. They provided an expression of culture and basically an insight into the Aboriginal struggle in dealing with issues such as separation from their family ties in the stolen generation, and also issues such as the loss of connection with their land through their removal by white settlement.